Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. Please silence all electronic devices. Our program is about to resume.
When you're a star, they let you do it. You can do anything.
Whatever you want.
Grab them by the
Women candidates are breaking all kinds of records.
Mr. Trump signed a sweeping order barring people from 7 predominantly Muslim nations.
We don't want them here.
Yet another officer-involved shooting of an unarmed African-American.
Let me see everybody raise up their hand.
Black Lives Matter! Black Lives Matter!
I'm a black man in America. That's 400 years of systemic oppression. Nothing will change unless we talk about it.
We never get justice. Today we got justice, sir.
All officers now carry tasers. There's body cameras.
24 million uninsured by 2026.
The rolling resistance.
If your baby is going to die, it shouldn't matter how much money you make.
Jews will not replace us!
Cities across the country are stepping up efforts to pull Confederate monuments.
This deadly mass shooting.
Do we allow the children to tell us that we should pass a law?
We call the end! Only one is
Students have walked out of their high schools.
Millennials could become the largest voting bloc in the entire country this year.
2,000 children have been separated from their parents at the U.S.-Mexican border.
After a terrifying month apart, mother and son finally reunite. Not going back.
Coming down, have somebody meet us.
I always hang on to the radio.
Please welcome to the stage Christine Lucius of the Leadership Conference.
Thank you so much. I am thrilled to introduce 2 popular, powerful women who were engaged in one of the most compelling fights, civil rights fights this summer, which involved the fight for the Supreme Court. First, we're going to hear from Dahlia Lithwick, who we all know and read. Her brilliance, her wit can make simple, very complex legal issues, but really touched many of us when she talked about her own MeToo experience with Judge Alex Kaczynski, and inspired other women to come forward and tell their own stories, leading to his resignation. And then we're also going to hear from Senator Mazie Hirono.
That's nice.
Mazie Hirono stands out in the Senate because she stands up for fellow immigrants, for fellow women, for fellow people of color, and she speaks for all of us who are fed up with what this president is trying to do to our courts. So we are thrilled to have her here today, and knowing that these 2 women are known for their spicy language, I think we're going to have a really active, lively conversation. So please welcome to the stage Senator Hirono and Dahlia Lithwick.
Go ahead, you
go first.
Oh, you want me to
because you sit in the chair ahead of me. Okay. Hi. Thank you. Thank you. Okay.
So I think
Aloha.
you're in the far chair.
Aloha, everybody.
And thank you to Christine for that lovely introduction. We're both pledging not to use spicy language.
Unless we're moved to do so. You never know.
Unless forced to. Senator, this is such a thrill. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Dahlia.
I guess, in one sense, this is a little bit of the grumpy panel. Because all morning we've been hearing about organizers and the elections and the blue wave and all the amazing stuff, and we're here to talk about the courts, and that's not necessarily the feel-good story of 2018. And we're poised to have likely even less success, although we had a big pushing back the FAR nomination was not inconsequential. But I guess I just wanted to lead with this question. This just feels like a juggernaut. Donald Trump has already seated a sixth of the federal judiciary, overwhelmingly 80% white, 80% male, some staggering 30% rated not qualified by the American Bar Association, and a few times, a few are batted away, usually if they disgrace themselves. But is this just one of those things where we're just going to have to swallow it for the next 2 years?
This is a perfect example, to me, of elections mattering. It makes a difference. And so as long as we don't have the majority in the Senate, I'm afraid that what we can do is to speak out and to point out how terrible all of these nominees are in terms of civil rights, women's rights, voting rights, all of the kinds of issues that we all care about, immigrant rights. And what we can do is to speak out, and one hopes that people voting will be able to connect the dots and realize that the people who are sitting in the Senate, that they're electing to the Senate, will be making decisions on confirming all of these terrible judges. And you forgot to mention that a huge percentage of them are all members of the Federalist Society, because you have these two organizations, the Federalist Society and the Heritage Foundation, who have spent decades and millions of dollars really just having all these people join when they're even in law school or young lawyers, and they are all prepared to become the kind of judges that will be people they can support. So we don't have anything institutionally that comes close, but we have our voices, so we have to start with that, I would say.
So I guess that leads to this question that is a much larger question than elections matter, which is, why the asymmetry, Senator? Why are Republicans so good at saying, we'll put up somebody who, could shoot somebody on Fifth Avenue, but it's okay because courts matter? And people vote for him. I mean, the exit polls suggested, but by about a 2-to-1 margin, people held their nose and voted because the courts matter. Why are Democrats, in that 2016 election, Democrats were not running on, there's a vacant seat called Merrick Garland, and Ruth Bader Ginsburg is 83, and Anthony Kennedy is 80, and Steve Breyer, we didn't peep about that.
And I think that we were very much responsible for not talking about those things, because it's so clear after Trump got elected. I don't think any of us thought that the man was going to get elected, for one thing. When that happened, and to realize that he was going to start court packing from day one, and of course aided and abetted by Mitch McConnell, who so arrogantly said that Merrick Garland, forget it, he's not even going to get to meet with any of us or have a hearing. It was just so astoundingly abnormal that it took us a while to, at least it took me a while to come to the conclusion that court packing is something that I want to have everybody in our country understand is going to impact their lives in terms of all of the issues. In January, I have people from Hawaii coming to see me to protect this, that, and every other kind of federal program, and I tell them, that all of these programs could be challenged in court, and you have the court packing, and if we don't connect those dots, we're just going to get continually screwed. So I think it's really important for us to, us meaning the Democrats particularly, we have a responsibility, in my view, to explain to everybody how important all this is. And I tell you, using the word screwed, I've actually said that on national TV, so what the heck.
Yeah, we're going to have to get to the. You use language on national TV that my kids would go to their room for.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
You should just chill then.
I know, I'm a horrible mother. If my children lay hands on this video, I am doomed for eternity. So before we let this go, I guess connected to this asymmetry of focus and intensity around the court, and obviously we're talking to a room of people who really, really care about the courts, what is the thing that Democrats need to be saying about why the courts matter. Like if it didn't work when we had a vacant seat that was held open for a year, and by the way, while Ted Cruz was campaigning on, right, Ted Cruz was running in 2016 saying not just, I held this seat open for a year, but I'll hold it open for 4 more years if Hillary gets elected. I mean, they're openly crusading about it. What is the thing Democrats need to say to help voters bump this from issue number 14 up to issue number 1?
I wish I had the answer to that, because one of the things that we Democrats have a really hard time is connecting to people's hearts instead of here. We're really good at shoving out all the information that touch people here but not here. And I have been saying at all of our Senate Democratic retreats that we need to speak to the heart, not in a manipulative way, not in a way that brings forth everybody's fears and resentments, but truly to speak to the heart so that people know that we're actually on their side. We have a really hard time doing that, and one of the reasons that it was told to me at one of our retreats was that we Democrats know so much. That is true. And we have to kind of tell everybody how smart we are, and so we have a tendency to be very left-brain, and we think this, really, that is not how people make decisions. So one of the books that I always bring up is The Righteous Mind by Jonathan Haidt, where the image is of an elephant, and the elephant is making all the decisions, go right, go forward, whatever. There's a rider on the elephant. The rider simply explains the elephant's decisions. Republicans speak to the elephant, the Democrats speak to the rider. That is why we're not speaking to people here, and we're just mainly going here. And it's a huge issue. So I tell people in my own way that I try to connect the dots with whatever program they're trying to support, whether it's immigrant rights, et cetera. I mean, most of the people who are immigration advocates already know very well that judges matter and the Senate matters. But there are a lot of programs that, social programs, et cetera, where they don't realize that these programs can all be set aside by the courts. Look at Lilly Ledbetter. Who knew that the court was going to throw out, decades of a certain kind of approach to employment discrimination? So I tell you, the Republicans are really good at being very focused on what they need to do, and we have a lot of issues and we're not as focused. But one of my areas of focus really is the court packing, because what does it matter who gets elected if you have, well, it does matter, but it really diminishes all of that if you just have people in the judiciary. You have the challenges, and I speak about it as much as possible. And most recently, 3 of us did an op-ed that appeared in already been done. Look what's happened already with the Voting Rights Act, with Lilly Ledbetter, with Citizens United, Janus, against public sector unions, and EPIC systems. That's a huge. I happened to be at a dinner sitting next to Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and the first thing I said to her was, Justice Ginsburg, you have to live forever. That was the first thing. And then I spoke about EPIC system, and she said, that was a horrible thing, and I forgot that she had written the major dissent on it. But that's yet another case which just totally undoes, furthers the attack on unions.
So you mentioned Justice Ginsburg, and I'm currently obsessed with the idea that Justice Ginsburg is angry. And the word they keep using is badass, which is the word that is now, look, I said a bad word. And it's a word that is now being affixed to you. There is this meme out there that is Senator Hirono has gone badass, and that you're swearing and that you're calling the president a liar and you're confronting these sexual predators for being sexual. When does it stop? I ask you.
It doesn't until the cultural changes occur that stops this kind of behavior. We have a ways to go, apparently.
But I think the reason I'm so struck by it, and I want to talk about the MeToo questions in a second, but I think you're actually not angry. I think you're just being you and speaking words, and it's getting mapped onto this rage disorder thing that the internet wants to put on you. But this isn't anger, right?
No, it isn't. I've been this way for quite a while now, and it's just that I have many more opportunities to be vocal and visible, which if Trump hadn't gotten elected, believe me, I would hardly be calling the president a liar, misogynist, and
xenophobic,
calling for xenophobic and admitted sexual predator. So I said that all in basically 2 sentences and one, encounter with the press. So I think it's really important for more of us to speak out. And believe me, any of you familiar with the Hawaii culture, I come from a culture that is not particularly confrontational. I'm of a race that is not particularly verbal, but I think it's very important for me. I mean, I didn't start out this way, by the way. It's a process. Becoming. And I feel like at this stage, I think it is important for more women to speak out, but it's not as I swear every other day or every other moment. And I tell you, with everything that's going on in this country, if you're not moved to swearing once in a while, you are not paying attention.
It's funny that the Canadian and the Hawaiian are talking about anger. My culture is also not one of fury.
There you go. We're very determined.
Yes. Though. Well, see, Canadians are just largely cold all the time. But I do want to talk about Judge Kaczynski because you started, in fact, I interviewed you last January, almost a year ago. You took it upon yourself. You said, I'm just going to ask every nominee, not even just the judicial nominees. I'm going to ask them my 2 questions. Those 2 questions are...
Well, whether as an adult they'd ever asked for sexual favors or engaged in any behavior that can be characterized as sexual harassment, and whether they have ever had to be disciplined or enter into any kind of a settlement based on this kind of behavior. So I asked those 2 questions of every nominee, male and female, and I bet I've already asked over 100 of them, and I know that everyone who comes before any of the 5 committees I sit on, if they are nominees, they will be asked these questions. They are prepared to respond to them, and I think it's really important. I mean, it's kind of fascinating, isn't it, from a cultural standpoint, that this kind of behavior that has been going on, and we women basically have had to put up with it since, sadly, since time immemorial, but all these nominees have never been asked these 2 simple questions on behavior that's been a scourge for so many years, in any kind of situation where there's a power thing going on mainly. So, 2 simple questions, and I did think about it, though, before I started asking them, because it had never been asked before, and I thought, should I do it? But I thought, you know what, the MeToo movement has every potential of being pushed under the rug, and I didn't want that to happen. I just didn't want everyone to forget about how important it is that we address the issue of sexual harassment and assault in our country, and as a senator, I could do my little part to keep that in the forefront. And believe me, if all these people, because every single one of them say they've never done any of this stuff.
Including Brett Kavanaugh.
Including Brett Kavanaugh, but of course he did it when he was not an adult.
Right.
See, that was like an escape. But if any of them had engaged in this kind of behavior and somebody comes forward, they're under oath. I think it makes a difference that they are under oath.
So I guess when you asked then Judge, now Justice Kavanaugh that question, you didn't have in your mind that all this was coming. You asked it because you'd asked everyone this question. But you were also very focused in his hearings on the fact that he clerked for Judge Kaczynski. What about that? Clearly you didn't want to let that go, nor did I. What about that was salient for you? What were you pressing on?
I think it was pretty unbelievable that the friendship that he has with Kaczynski, the fact that Kaczynski testified on his behalf when he was first up for the circuit judgeship, that it was pretty unbelievable, not just to me, but to everyone, that he had never heard word one, no inkling that Kaczynski was engaging in this kind of behavior. And from what I understand, he was pretty notorious for the kind of comments and the behavior. And for Kavanaugh to say he had never had any inkling of it was pretty darn amazing. But as we went on with the hearing, and clearly during the Dr. Ford and his testimony, he was either evasive or I would say, especially when he was asked questions about what the words in his yearbook mean, I think pretty much everybody, I actually got some people calling me saying, the guy is lying. This is males who called, saying he's lying. But my gosh, so this man is on the Supreme Court, it makes me weep.
Yeah, I just went a different place for a second. I was just thinking it's my job to cover the Supreme Court, and it makes me weep. So I think I want to go back to that room, that hearing room. Vanita and you and I were all in that tiny little room. I think if you watched TV, you didn't necessarily get a sense of, that was a small room, and Judge Kavanaugh was in fact shouting and slamming his binder and slamming his pen. And I guess I want to close the circle, having said, you one time said, shut up, and the internet went crazy because of your anger problem. And here, this man was screaming and
crying and accusing
crying.
people. Half of the interviewing him for a job, that we were all part of a conspiracy. I thought it was really an unbelievable performance on his part. And then you had Dr. Ford, just the nicest person, coming forward with something that was so painful to her and her family, and there he was going on. And so the double standard is alive and well in our country. And this is why when I say certain things, which I describe as speaking plainly, I get, I have my share of criticism and people who think that all I do is swear, which I don't. But, it's a double standard. They expect us to behave a certain way. And the thing is that more people come up to me now all over the place saying things such as, you just speak the way I'm thinking, that this is all bullshit. There, I said it. Yay!
Drops mic. Yep.
So I say to people, it is not as though my communications people write down, this is where you say bullshit. It just comes out. And, where I said that the men in our country who are the perpetrators, who are basically, more of them are doing this kind of behavior, I said the men in this country just shut up and step up and do the right thing for a change. And there are some people who took offense at that, but there are a lot of men who tell me that they didn't find that offensive at all. And in fact, now I'm getting some calls from men who say, I am now shutting up and stepping up.
All right.
So there.
So I think this goes to this point about the sort of norms and conventions of the Senate. One of the things that Senator Lindsey Graham was shouting about was how this was so violative of the norm of being nice to each other, and he shouted that. But I think that one of the things that it seems to me you're trying to do is to say, look, all these norms of civility and comedy and the way we treat one another are lovely, but there are real people, as you keep saying, who are getting shellacked, every day, and that we have to there's something beyond being kind to each other in the Senate. And I'm just so curious about why that has, it's seen as so transgressive that you're trying to blow up Senate norms. You're not trying to blow up Senate norms. You're just saying this civility covers for real inequity and injustice, right?
Totally. For people to talk about how we should have civility, and yet they have no problems voting for a bill that would knock 25 million people off of our health care. They have no problems with children being separated at the border. They hardly ever speak out, and that's why I've said, they're just basically, they're cowards. And so don't talk to me about civility when all these things are going on. And people, minorities, women, LGBTQ minorities are just being raked over the coals. And I have said to my staff, before all of this happened, by the way, that one of the reasons I am in office is because I know that there are people in our country who are getting screwed every single second, minute, hour of the day, and if by our efforts we can decrease that number, we will be making a difference, and we will be doing our jobs. And I believe this. I've been saying this to my staff for years. I say, every person who comes to my office, just know that they would like us to help them, and that's what we're there for. But to really understand that I just met with advocates from the immigration community, and they told me stories about how the family separation hurts them, and I've experienced that in my own life, of course, but all of this pain is going on and being pushed out and supported, by the way, by lack of speaking out against it, by people who are saying, oh, we should be more civil to each other.
Right.
Oh, just shut up. Really?
And you've made this point just about your own. I think folks know you recently had about a cancer diagnosis, and you made the same point that everybody in the Senate was sending you these heartfelt notes about get well at the same time they were voting to repeal Obamacare. And I wonder, do you see part of your job to say, like, there's this world that you live in, and then there's this world that everyone else lives in? Like, come join us here in reality, because it's sending a letter saying get well soon doesn't get you there.
And I think it was heartfelt. I think it was genuine that when they wrote to me saying that, please, we're praying for you and all that. I believe that that was really heartfelt. But then they're able to bifurcate their behavior in really strange ways that I can't explain. And so I think the inability to empathize is a huge part of what happens with too many Republicans. They can't put themselves into the other person's shoes. And I realize empathy can be taught, but obviously they haven't learned that lesson. So I think it's really important going forward that we, I think it was Rebecca Tracer, she wrote a book about women's anger, that we should remain angry but very determined. We should not forget what it felt like to watch Dr. Ford testifying and what it meant to so many. Dr. Ford was vacationing in Hawaii recently, and she asked to speak with me and see me, and she was just as decent and kind person as she appeared in her testimony. And she said she could not have lived with herself if she did not come forward, because she knew that he was probably going to get confirmed, but it just shows that there are some battles that are worth fighting, and that was one worth fighting. And there are going to be many more battles that we're going to need to fight, but we just have to keep doing it. And I want to thank all of you who are fighting those battles, because these are not normal times. It's not just me or any one of us. It's all of us. And I know that sounds sort of like, I don't know, rhetorical or whatever it is, but it is going to take all of us to fight those battles and to speak out. I do hear from a lot of women who say that they're motivated now to speak up for themselves and to speak out, because of what they see is just the inequity that's happening in our country, and it's just sort of hit them in the face where they live. So I am hopeful.
Rebecca Tracer always says, people ask her, was Christine Blasey Ford and MeToo, is this a movement or a moment? And I think what you've just said is, that depends on us.
Yes, it better be a movement, not a moment.
So my last question, I think, is you have all these people in this room who do this work. What do we do to support what seems this kind of very difficult mission you have, which is focusing people on the courts at a time when, like, oh my God, everything is crazy. I mean, nobody covers these judiciary hearings anymore because they're all the same. They're stacked and they're crazy, and what are you going to do? And they're getting through. How do we help you focus the mind on the problem you and I started this conversation with, which is Ruth Bader Ginsburg is 85. This court, the median justice is now John Roberts. This is the most conservative court we've had in 100 years. And the court packing, as you're describing it, what Trump is doing, particularly on the appeals courts, is only in one direction for the next 2 years. How do we help you get the message out that this is something that it's just not as sexy as Bob Mueller, but it's important and we need to think about it?
I think it's pretty important to people if they know that the Supreme Court will probably decide the Texas case that's going to undo the protections for people with pre-existing conditions, which is 1 out of 4 people. So when I tell them that and I say, you know what, the Supreme Court can make a decision that's going to justify doing away with these protections, and then what are you going to do with your health care? You either won't get it or you won't be able to afford it. So to connect those dots, and then there's also a growing discussion about court reform. And I'm very interested in what we can do to take out some of the high-stakes battles that go on with these lifetime appointments. And my hope is that when we start talking about how we can make some changes, particularly to the Supreme Court, that maybe we'll be making some kind of progress, but the discussions need to start. And I know that some of you are probably already involved in those kind of discussions, and they have to reach a more of a understanding by the larger community. So Sheldon Whitehouse and I were two people who really thought about what can we do to fight back against the climate change deniers and the anti-immigrant people, all of that. And part of it is to have our own sort of institutional ability to respond to all of the terrible things that the right wing pushes out all the time on all kinds of platforms and mediums. So that's something that individuals can do to take it upon yourself, write a law review article or speak at a gathering or do something, because I think that it all makes a difference. It's all making a difference. So that's what I ask of you folks.
And it has something to do, I think, with, so many of the folks we heard from this morning are about making that which is invisible visible, and particularly making it visible to the Senate in Dr. Blasey Ford's case, or making it visible to the courts in a way that, by the time these abstractions get to them, you can say it's just the Census case. But this isn't just the Census case, right? These are real people suffering real harms. And it feels to me that maybe this moment, and certainly everything I've heard at this conference today, really is about saying, like, we're here, we're not going away, we're making that which doesn't seem to break through the surface in the Capitol sometimes. And it does feel like it has something to do with empathy. I mean, when you talk about, imagining someone else's life, that just seems like it's in short supply in Washington or in the quarters of Washington.
Well, it definitely is, and I call it an ability to just kind of bifurcate what you're doing. But what was I going to say?
I didn't really ask a question. I was just free-associating.
But while you were speaking, I was thinking about some things that we ought to be doing. I am very encouraged by the young people who marched for sensible gun legislation. I'm very encouraged by all the thousands of DACA people who came forward, and I believe that through that experience, if they ever become United States citizens, because we will provide them that opportunity, they will start running for office and they will make a difference. And look at the U.S. House now with minority representation. So, and the scientists who marched. Right. I mean, who ever heard of scientists marching? Wow. So there's a dynamic going on with more people becoming engaged. Or the thing that occurred to me was that I heard from people who were traveling all over the world, in Brazil and different places, and they would show the Kavanaugh hearings.
Yeah.
So the impact of what was going on with those hearings and how our country would view Dr. Ford, and they all watched Kavanaugh crying and screaming and accusing. I think they all shook their heads as to what's going on in America. But that interest is there. And so I think that we have to stay engaged in whatever way that we can. And also, because these are not normal times, to reach out to other groups that we normally may not be collaborating with and working with, and to be very supportive. And I think that's how you get I hope, a critical mass of people who will then go to the polls and choose the kind of people who are not going to screw us over.
There's that word again.
Yes.
Okay.
It's a good word.
Okay. Now I do have to ask you this question, because I think you are the only immigrant in the U.S. Senate, right? You were born in Japan, raised in Hawaii. How do you, when you hear the just ferocious, weird anti-immigrant sentiment of this moment, does that map onto something that you know and remember, or is that just, are you shocked that it's out there? Are you shocked it's this virulent, or do you hear this and say, like, yeah, I know this? I guess I'm just wondering, is this astonishing in your life experience, or does it feel familiar and depressing?
Well, it's pretty depressing, but I think that racism is never far below the surface in our country. And if you go back historically, I mean, we started with the American Indians, and then we had the Chinese Exclusion Act, we had the internment of Japanese Americans, you have the Muslim ban. So racism is never far below the surface in our country, and we have to be continuously alert to that popping up. And of course, the Supreme Court's decision that validated what many of us call the Muslim ban just gives, in my view, Trump more of a power to designate whatever it is he does as for national security. And I suppose the Supreme Court would not look behind that declaration. So. Yeah, I am an immigrant, and my immigrant experience is never far from my memory because I was almost 8 years old. I have a lot of memories of what it was like growing up with a single parent and what it was like for my family to be separated from my younger brother because we couldn't afford to bring him and my grandparents. So, I take all of that and I bring it to the fore, and it keeps me going. The other thing that keeps me going, and I would suggest it to all of you as we are blasted on a fairly regular basis by what this administration is doing in the Trump. You have to have at least one Trumpless day. And so I have a Trumpless Sunday where I don't watch the news or anything, and I do things that are soul restoring.
Trumpless Sunday.
Oh, Trumpless Sundays. Sometimes I need the entire weekend to be Trumpless. And we need that.
So somebody actually this morning on one of the panels said the problem is when you tune him out, he's still there doing really, really bad stuff.
Yeah.
So I guess it's Trumpless Sunday and then a really Trumpy Monday morning.
Oh yeah, I know that it's all waiting for me on Monday, but I think we all need to do things that are much more creative and soul restoring, as I call it. Go to the museums, do art, or do whatever it is, read. It helps me a lot to know that I don't have to turn on MSNBC or CNN on Sundays. It's really nice. Try it.
Trumpless Sunday. Okay.
Yes.
It's good for your figure. So I guess this really is legit. My last question. I got the time wrong before because I'm addled. But I think that one of the things that a lot of folks have talked about today is hope. Mm-hmm. And in some sense, you're kind of in a not super hopey institution right now because the Senate is like not the hopiest place in America. The House really is, I think, undergoing. It must be thrilling to see what's happening, particularly with women and women of color in the House. But I'm just wondering if you could maybe just send us off with just thoughts about how you see us extracting ourselves from this. What gives you, in other words, on Trumpy Monday, when you wake up and you're just like, oh my God, we have to deal with DACA and sanctuary cities and vote suppression and gerrymandering and all of it. And also there's a panel of 42 judges that I have 6 seconds to question. What gives you hope?
What's the alternative? Really,
beer. I
don't think any of us are made in a way that we just want to throw in the towel. I don't think that's why you're here. And so I just keep going, and I think that's what we have to do. That people are always asking me, because I'm still undergoing treatment, by the way, because I'm not exactly cancer-free, but they ask me how's it going, and I say I just keep plugging away. That's what we do. That's what we have to do. You just keep plugging away and find other people who are plugging away, because the thing that the other side wants most is for us to be so distressed and depressed, and we'll go away. And that's the last thing that we should even be thinking about. And so do whatever you need to do in order to get back that energy and find other people. And I'm not just saying that because it sounds good, but that's how I proceed. And I have a wonderful staff that keeps me going, and I have Trumpless Sundays, and I do those things that will enable me to keep going. And I think friendships matter, and trying to be kind, and all of those kinds of things that sometimes we forget in the battle, but knowing full well that we have to stay in the fight. And I think I think it was Teddy Roosevelt who once wrote that. It's those of us who remain in the arena, and I am certainly paraphrasing, but who remain in the arena, and we are bloodied, but we stay in the arena, and that's where we ought to be, as opposed to there are a lot of people on the outside who take pot shots at us and who criticize what we do, politicians and all of that, but I am reminded that if you're never bloodied, then you're not in the battle, and so that's what we have to keep staying in the arena.
And yet you said be kind, and you're in an institution that gets pretty shouty, and you get a little shouty sometimes. So how do you...
I speak plainly.
That's what I mean. That's what I mean.
Can I just tell you one story? So there's always, I do a lot of my bills, and maybe I shouldn't say this, but
go ahead.
President Trump has signed more of my bills into law than just about any other Democratic senator. But I think it's because they don't put down who the sponsors of the bills are. But it's not easy to get standalone bills passed, but I have, until Amy Klobuchar caught up with me, I had the record of having more standalone bills enacted into law than any other member of either the House or the Senate.
Wow.
And I work in a very bipartisan way.
Yeah.
All these bills I had bipartisan sponsors because I tell my staff it is very important that we find a Republican that I can work with because we understand that these are issues that face their constituents. And so I've been able to do that. But I'll tell you one story about Jeff Sessions, which is maybe not that well known. But Jeff Sessions, before he was Attorney General, helped me pass my very first bill. And it had to do with high-on relief, and this was the huge hurricane, terrible disaster that befell the Philippines. And I had a bill that would encourage people to continue to send money and get a tax write-off. And I had to get that bill out of the Senate in a very time-constrained manner. And so when we call for, when we go to the floor of the Senate and we yank a bill out of a committee, ask for UC consent, and all it takes is one senator to say, I object. So I'm down there and I'm pulling this bill out of the committee. And I see Jeff Sessions walking in. This is about 11 o'clock at night. And I see him going into the Republican cloakroom. And so I go in there and he said, first of all, he looked really surprised. And he said, I'm here to say I object to your UC request. And I said, I know, that's why I'm here to talk with you. And I asked him, why is your caucus so against this bill? I know he was not prepared to answer such a question, so he just said, we don't like these kinds of bills, and we like to be consistent. And I said, consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds. Let me tell you why this bill is so important. And then I think the thing that really affected him was I was talking with him and talking about how the Philippines are our allies, thousands of them died, and all of that. And I reached out and I touched his heart. And I said, I am speaking to this. And it just took him aback, and he said, well, you're very persuasive. I still have to go out and say I object, but maybe we can work something out. And then something happened on the floor of the Senate that I've never seen happen before. So he objected, but then he said, my friend from Hawaii, this is really important to her, and I hope that we can work something out. And within, I would say, half an hour, we had worked something out. That bill got through the Senate, and then I had to go talk to Eric Cantor, who was 6 years serving in the House. I had never talked to. He was the speaker at that time. And I called him, and so got him on board, and then the president had to also be alerted because we had to, But he helped me pass, Jeff Sessions helped me pass my very first standalone bill. But then I said to him, I'm sorry, I still can't support you for Attorney General. But nonetheless, I really feel like I can find something to work with just about anybody. That doesn't mean I excuse their silence or anything like that, but at the same time, there are things that we can get done in a bipartisan way, and that's one of the things that keeps me going, to know that the president, I hope, is about to sign yet another one of my standalone bills. Don't tell him.
We're out of time, Senator, but I want to just close by saying that one of the things that has really given me hope in this past year, and especially I think you probably know for some of the women who spoke out initially against Judge Kaczynski, how really scary and vulnerable and lonely that enterprise was, and truly, truly knowing that right out the chute, you were going to stand in the spotlight and be the voice of that in the Senate. That really changed everything for me and for a lot of women, so thank you.
Well, thank you. And it's not just me. There are others.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Mahalo. Yep. Thank you. Thank you. Good. Thank you. Okay, steps. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Am I still mic'd?
Sorry, I cocked up the time.
Okay.
Please welcome to the stage from Latino Victory Fund, Cristobal Alex.
Good afternoon, folks. How are y'all doing today? It's so great to be back here at the Leadership Conference. I'm honored to be back. You all are the heart of the civil rights movement. And I remember when I was a baby civil rights lawyer and I first had the chance to come to Washington, D.C. and come to a leadership conference meeting, I was completely in awe. This is where history is made. These are where the big fights happen. And I'm so glad to be back, the core of the civil rights movement. We're talking about bending the arc. The arc goes through this room, and I can't tell you how happy I am today to join you. Let me start with a personal story. I'm the president of the Latino Victory Fund. We work to build Latino political power around the country by electing Latinos up and down the ballot and by pushing back aggressively on those that attack our community, that attack immigrants. And I come at it from a civil rights perspective. What you see here is a picture of my grandfather, Esteban. These are his bracero papers. These are the papers, the documents that he got from the government so that he could come from Zacatecas, Mexico, with his entire family, to toil in the fields, to be migrant farm workers and do the really heavy lifting that this country requires. And my mom was the eldest of 10, and they struggled in the fields from California, from Bakersfield to the panhandle of Texas, so that my brother Richie and I, and this is us back in the day in El Paso, Texas, would have the chance that she didn't have, so that my family would have the opportunities that they didn't have. And I remember when I was really little, a little older than in this picture probably, my mom told me that if we worked really hard and we put our heart into it, we could achieve whatever we wanted to in this country. And that was our version growing up of the American dream, which is now under attack. And I remember my mom would say, Richie, to my brother, you can be whatever you want to be in this country. Now, Richie always wanted to be president of the United States. He has a heart of gold. He works really hard. He's an artist. He's the sweetest guy you'll ever meet. He's also a person with autism. And I share that because growing up with him, it really influenced my life. And I remember one particular episode. We were on the playground, and this bully, this big guy, came and pushed my brother down. And I was a little wimp at the time. I wasn't yet really buff like I am today. And for whatever reason, I just kind of stood there and I froze. I didn't do anything to protect my brother or to stand up for Richie. And I regret that to this day. It's a feeling of shame and embarrassment that I'll never get over. And I told myself at that point that I'm never going to let some bully come around and push my brother down again and not do anything about it. And that's what's led a lot of my work, and I think probably leads a lot of your work. Similar stories like that that brought you into this critical movement for people like my brother and others. And it leads to our work at Latino Victory. So this is another story I want to share with you. This here is a picture of a colonia in the Rio Grande Valley. You guys know what a colonia is? It's like an unincorporated area, very poor. And according to the 2010 census, this was the poorest census tract in the nation. And you can tell how poor it is. They didn't have any roads, poor services, lack of infrastructure. And there were 1,200 registered voters in this area, but only about 150 ever turned out to vote. The residents of this community pressed their local elected to fix the roads. They wanted services in this area. And the local guy, who was a county judge, said, why bother? Nobody out there votes anyways. And they pressed him and they said, what would it take to show proof of life? And he said 300 votes. Well, they organized, and they turned out 500 people for a local election. This is the same road 2 years later. It's the type of work that we need to do together as a community day in and day out. Now, the other reason why this is so important, not only because this is how we best integrate our people, our gente, into our democracy, these local issues that matter most, that really affect them, but it's also where we're going to find the future leaders of tomorrow through these sorts of campaigns. Now, this was at about 2012 that this picture was taken. A few things have happened since then that have surprised me and surprised others. Unlike this road, which is nice and straight, the path to civil rights, as you all know better than anybody, is a windy, treacherous, sometimes very dangerous path. It's not straight like this. And in 2015, we got this guy. He started his campaign on the very first day by attacking immigrants, by attacking Latinos, by attacking Mexicans, calling us rapists, calling us thieves. At the time, I thought there was no way in the world this guy was going to get elected. I literally laughed and retweeted, I think, his opening because I thought it was a joke. I thought there was no way in this country today that we could elect somebody like this whose entire campaign was based upon racism. Well, he got elected, surrounded himself with white supremacists and white nationalists, and has since followed through on his promises. He's abandoned Puerto Rico. This is a picture of him on the island. He's pardoned America's most famous racial profiler and Sheriff Joe Arpaio. He's separated children from their mothers at the border. More recently, he's gassed them as they sought asylum in this country. He's attacked our health care. He's attempted to roll back core civil and human rights that everybody in this room cherishes and fights for, that people have lost their lives for. So, the road has been a tough one, and I have a new daughter. She's actually here. You might have heard her. Where's little baby boss? Somewhere back there in the corner is my little baby boss, Vivian, who's going to turn 1 year old on Saturday. And it was the best thing that's ever happened in my life after this terrible election to have this beautiful baby come into my life. And it instilled in me even a stronger core belief that we have to work even harder and to fight back even more aggressively. Because I never want her to wake up and feel that pang of rejection and hatred that so many felt in 2016 on that Wednesday morning, or that many felt in this last election day in places like Georgia, where we had an election stolen, or in Florida, where we had an election stolen, and in other places. So, what are we doing about it? We set out some extremely audacious goals this year. We wanted to double the number of Latino progressives that we elected to office. We wanted to grow the Hispanic caucus and take back the House because we knew that was the primary bulwark of defense against this horrible president who has put us in the crosshairs. We wanted to finally elect a Latina Democratic governor, which we've never had, considering we're 18% of the population, but only 1% of all elected officials. We wanted to get ready to impact redistricting because that is one of the core areas that we've fallen back on. Really, it's a civil rights issue, as you know. So all over the country, we had a 500% increase in the number of Latinos running for office that we're helping. 500% increase. Partly, we think, and we've been saying this, that Donald Trump, as horrible as he is going to prove to be the greatest Latino political organizer of all time. And guess what? They ran 280,000, I'm not kidding about this, 280,000 anti-immigrant ads in this last election. Is that insane or what? They're trying to borrow from Trump's playbook to rile up their base, defeat progressives, and steal elections. So what did we do? How did it go? Well, he was right about one thing. There was a caravan that showed up on Election Day. It was our voters. Let me show you this funny picture here for a second. This is what actually happened on Election Day. Now, let me show you something else. As hard as it was to mobilize these voters and elect all these candidates, we had to deal with some of our own problems on our side of the wall, right? The Democratic Party sometimes, old school operatives, the establishment, whatever you want to call it. And even our own friends have said things like this. This is an actual email that I got from a progressive donor, one of the top donors in New York City, a liberal bastion. He says here, if Latinos don't vote, it's hard to feel sorry for the consequences affecting them. They should realize that and who their friends are. And this is an actual all-caps email he sends. Please emphasize to these folks that if they don't vote, they'll be further worse off. And if they don't vote, don't complain. So this is our friend, right? Look at what the media was doing. Just before the election, in articles around the country, we started saying things like this. Dems are fretting because they're not going to turn out, we're going to lose the House. Over and over and over again. I couldn't tell you the number of times we were reading this, and a little bit of panic was starting to set in because we don't want to be blamed for losses, especially if they're not true. Because we knew from our own data that Latinos were going to turn out and explode in this election. And they did. This is from a New York Times headline. 174% increase in early vote. That is massive. It has never happened before. We turned out at levels of a presidential election, not a midterm election. Exploding turnout in key races across the country, and a key reason why we took back the House. We're extremely proud of candidates like Antonio Delgado in this picture, and a number of others. We elected, for example, the very first Latina Democrat to Congress from Florida, and Debbie Murcastel-Powell. We elected the youngest ever in Alexandria Ocasio from New York. We elected the first Latina Democratic governor in New Mexico, Michelle Lujan Grisham, the first Democratic Hispanic governor ever. The list goes on, and these were history-making wins across the board. We couldn't be more proud of our community, more proud of our candidates. I couldn't be more proud of our incredible small but mighty staff that worked tirelessly in a very thankless job to do this, while our friends, the press, and others were piling it on. So we're proud of it, but it's not all perfect. There's clearly more work to do. The thing I want to draw your attention to, most importantly here, is that first stat. A record 1 in 4 Latino voters cast a ballot for the first time this cycle. I first saw that in 2016 in some of the data, that about 26% of Latino voters that year were first-time voters, which is extremely high. A quarter had never voted before compared to 15% of whites and 16% of African Americans. And the reason why that's so interesting and important is because these are new voters coming into our system that represent the future. You know, the greatest indicator of whether you're going to vote is whether you voted before. So think about that. A quarter of these folks had never voted before. And I was a little bit worried that we would lose them. You know, someone said, with all of this energy around the Women's March and then the anger in 2017 and all of that, aren't people just going to burn themselves out? And aren't we going to lose all of these first-time voters and everybody else? I got a little worried about it. But the truth is, that anger is really the gas in the tank. And this president keeps refilling that gas tank. And that's why we saw, in part, this historic wave election last year and why our candidates came out on top around the country. Really phenomenal. We won 75% of our races. We had 58 candidates, and we're exceedingly proud of that, and we're going to be building on that. But like I said, it's not all perfect. This here is where I'm going to end today's presentation. Earlier today, I think you heard from a dear friend of mine, Andrew Gillum. Did you hear his speech? I love him. And he worked very hard in his race in Florida. And so did Stacey Abrams in Georgia, another dear friend of ours. And what we wanted to make sure we did this year, still as a newer organization, is to work in coalition. We Latinos need to stand with our African American brothers and sisters and our Native American brothers and sisters and our Asian American brothers and sisters and our women allies, et cetera, et cetera. We have to do better about that as a civil rights community. So for the first time ever, we invested 6 figures into Stacey Abrams' coordinated campaign and traveled to Georgia and knocked on doors for Stacey Abrams. and worked with our candidates down ballot there. We had a bus tour through Georgia and places that I'd never been to before, but that I intend to go back to knock on doors for her again. And in Florida, this is the last day of early vote. We brought the sort of Latina A-team, the super mujeres, the Eva Longoria and America Ferreira and Gina Rodriguez and Rosario Dawson and others to campaign in Orlando and in Miami, and to really hyper-focus on exploiting the Latino vote for our candidates, but really also for our dear friend Andrew. And you saw some press today probably, and in other places that are saying, you know, part of the reason why we lost in Florida is because the Latino vote, again, a little bit of a blame coming our way, wasn't where it needed to be, right? Yes, we have to do better as a community. The Democratic Party has to do better. The donors have to do better because we have to invest earlier in our community. Now, you don't hear people complaining about the 80,000, about spending money on the 80,000 folks who cost the 2016 election in Michigan, right? Wisconsin. Like, we don't hear about that. This is where we need to invest. Cross-cultural, cross-institutional, making sure that our voters are working together. And the real reason, I would say, that he lost this election is because of voter suppression. It's the same reason why Stacey lost. It's because of voter suppression. That's the civil rights issue of our time. And I'll close with this picture of my brother. I started with Richie, talking about the impact he's had in my life. Well, you know, in 2012, he cast a vote for the first African-American president. He lives in Texas. This is the same year that they passed a horrible draconian voter ID law. It was the strictest in the country. You'll recall this is the law that says if you have a concealed handgun permit, you can vote, but if you have a University of Texas student ID card, you cannot vote. Think about that for a minute. So because of the folks in this room, many of you, because of the leadership conference, that law was enjoined. It wasn't in effect that day because of the hard civil rights work. So it allowed my brother to go into the voting booth. Unbeknownst to him, the El Paso Times, our paper of record was there, our New York Times of El Paso, was out there. He walked out of the voting booth. They got a picture. It made the front page of our local paper, and it's printed out, and it's hanging in his room. That was the best day of his life. So I urge you to continue fighting for what you're doing, fighting for people like my brother, standing up to bullies like Donald Trump, and fighting for Baby Boss and all of our baby bosses out there. So with that, I want to thank you and urge you to continue, and I'll see you at your party later tonight. Hey, how are you? Hey, I'm sorry, that went a little long. I didn't see that little dot. Forgive me. Thanks. Hey. This me? Oh, gracias. That went a little long. I'm sorry. I didn't see the little red dot until I was like, oh shit! It's flashing at me. How long did I go over?
I don't think we were
like 5 minutes or something. Okay, good. I hate eating into other people's time.
No worries.
Hi, everyone. Woo, sorry. Good afternoon. This is the last but not least. I am super excited to welcome my dear friend, the Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal. She is the state of Washington's 7th Congressional District representative. She is the first Indian American woman to serve in the House of Representatives. I just learned that she is one of only 11 immigrants to serve in Congress. And I got to tell you, I've known her for years, so I knew her as a badass civil rights activist when she was in Seattle fighting for immigrants' rights, building a movement, really, with One America. This is a woman who has immense heart and courage. And back in June, when the Trump administration was found to be separating children from their parents at the border, she was one of the first to go down to the border and investigate and bear witness to what was happening. And she called us up and said, this is a time for moral action. We cannot sit by. Even though Congress is refusing to provide oversight, we are going to take to the streets. And we had an amazing day at the end of June where in 750 cities around the country, people mobilized to save the soul of our country. And that is who Pramila Jayapal is. She just is returning from a trip to the border this past weekend. And for any of you who haven't seen it, I would urge you to pick up the New York Review of Books. She wrote a really bracing piece yesterday on the moral imagination of immigration. She's holding down the fort, and she's now the co-chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, 90-member big and strong. Please welcome my dear, dear friend, Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal, in conversation with Dara Lind from the Vox.
Afternoon, folks. Good afternoon, Congresswoman.
Good afternoon, Leadership Conference. How are you? I heard you had an amazing day, and we promise the last session will be good.
I want to know, can you talk to us about what you saw in Tijuana over the weekend and what you did in Tijuana over the weekend?
Yeah, so as Vanita said, and I just want to start by saying how incredibly fortunate the Leadership Conference is to have Vanita Gupta as the head of it. She is just phenomenal. She has been fighting her whole life, getting people to do all kinds of things that people never thought were possible. And I just wish she was still the Attorney General for Civil Rights. That would be an incredible thing, but I'm glad she's here. And I really want to thank all of you at the Leadership Conference for the work that you've done for so long in creating the kind of coalition that has real power in fighting for civil, immigrant, and human rights. So give yourselves a round of applause for that, because I think that is really important. So I have obviously been fighting for immigrant rights my whole life, and was out front on the family separations piece. I've been following very closely what's been happening at the southern border. About a week ago, when I saw that they were tear gassing mothers and children, I felt I really needed to go down to the border and see for myself what happened. And so I flew down on Friday night. We crossed over into Tijuana on Saturday. We spent the whole day on Saturday, first at the plaza where most of the caravan and the asylum seekers and the folks in the caravan had gathered. They were being moved the very day that we were there, which was also AMLO's inauguration as president. So it's a really interesting time on a number of levels. But they had just set up a new shelter called El Barrital, which is about 20 or 25 minutes away. And so we drove to El Barrital. It's set up for about 8,000 people to be there. There were about 1,500 when I went. Most of them are still being transferred. We spent a lot of time in the family part of the shelter, talking to families, a father whose son has cerebral palsy, who has literally been on the road from Honduras. Most of the people we talked to were from Honduras, but not all. And it's important that people know there's a big group of Cameroonians and Haitians who are there. And I heard a particularly harrowing story from a 17-year-old who had traveled with her mother from Haiti to Venezuela, Venezuela to Colombia, Colombia to Panama, Panama to Ecuador, Ecuador to Mexico, an 8-month trip, including slashing their way through forests in Latin America. And so just so that there's a context, but the majority of asylum seekers that I spoke with were from Honduras, and the stories were as horrific as you might imagine. People fleeing, not seeking the American dream, just fleeing a reign of terror. Women whose husbands had been murdered, children who had actually seen their father killed, a pregnant woman, 7.5 months pregnant, who had traveled with her, with her partner because her ex-partner had threatened to kill her, and people really fleeing the most horrendous situations. And not to get long into history, but the history of the United States' lack of involvement in really holding the Honduran government responsible since the coup happened, I think is something to be considered. And so we spoke to the folks at the shelter. Then we went to a women's shelter, Madre, We also went to a shelter that holds unaccompanied minors, and everything is horrendous, but I think it's particularly awful for the unaccompanied minors who are literally not allowed to get on the list, which is a very strange thing that is outsourced basically to a quasi-governmental organization plus the Mexican authorities, and they keep this informal list. There's a book. We went to visit the table.
Have they fixed, I was there like 6 weeks ago and it didn't look like the book was much longer for this world. Is it a new book? Is it the same book?
It's the same book, but it is just, people just show up at the table and they get a number. So you can imagine the pieces of paper with the number on them, how much they sell for. There are reports of women having to perform sexual favors to get their name in the book. And that is the process that the United States government has basically allowed to happen or outsourced. So when a name is called, then the person gets to come and present themselves at the border. But if you're an unaccompanied minor, you are not allowed on the list. And if you put yourself on the list, then you are immediately turned over to DIF, which is the Mexican authorities responsible for unaccompanied children. And you never get to the border. And so we went to a lot of these places, and then I ended the day at around 5 or 6 o'clock. I had gone to visit with Al Otro Lado, an amazing organization that works with asylum seekers, run by a former federal defender who used to work in Montgomery, Alabama. She's tough, and she really knows what she's doing. And I accompanied a group of 5 asylum seekers, 2 unaccompanied minors, 1 mother and her 9-year-old child, and a young man, about 26 or 27, who had been beaten in Honduras and suffered serious medical conditions. And they were initially turned away at the border, and through a lot of convincing and a lot of talking and mentioning that I'm a member of Congress and we appropriate dollars for the Customs and Border Protection, and that it is in our laws that if you present seeking asylum, you have a fear of being killed or persecuted, that you have the right to a credible fear hearing. That is absolutely legal. And we were finally able to get them in, and thanks to a really compassionate border chief as well. So we were finally able to get them all in. But that is not how it should be. People should be able to come and seek asylum. And for everything that the White House says, I don't need to tell the people in this room, we are not actually a particularly outrageously generous country in terms of asylum seekers. We are 50th in the world in terms of the numbers of asylum seekers that we allow in compared to population GDP. So what the Trump administration has done is basically cut everything to a trickle, stopped the ability for people to actually come and apply for asylum. And not everybody down there is an asylum seeker. There are a lot of economic migrants, and so it is unfortunate that we have stopped the processing so that the differentiation can be made, and people who really have this deep fear of being killed would not be able to go through that processing. So it was a very emotional time. In some ways the stories were horrific, but we had just had the family separation too, so it's terrible that the bar has been set so high for horrificness.
Yeah, I want to talk more about that, because what you're describing is not just a policy challenge, it's also, kind of a political or organizing challenge, that all of this is happening, by design or by neglect, off of US soil, outside of, what people are going to see on, cable news B-roll. How do you make things that are happening outside the US and officially not think the US government is even actively doing, just kind of shutting their eyes to, seem urgent and create a movement around that in the way you would with something like family separation, where it was so obvious what was being done and what could be done to stop it?
Well, that's why I went down, and I think that's why we have to keep talking about this, and we have to put the stories out there, because I do have a platform, being a member of Congress, and I can use it to tell the stories. So we interviewed, we spent hours and hours interviewing people, live streaming what we were doing, writing about it. We'll have op-ed coming out on it. I hope to be able to talk about it a lot more in this way to tell the actual stories. And we just have to recognize that this isn't actually something that's happening outside of the US, it is on our border. And yes, we're using all kinds of technicalities to prevent people from getting to the border, but we are signatories to international human rights treaties that require us to allow people to seek asylum. And we have domestic law that allows us to do that. So I think we just have to make this relevant, and I'm also somebody who thinks that all these issues around the world are deeply relevant to who we are as a country, and we don't live in an isolated world, we live in a global world, and so people in the United States do sometimes have a challenge thinking about everywhere around the country, around the world, but I think this is right here on our border, and people need to be paying attention to it, but with our narrative, not with the narrative of Fox News and the constant lies and falsehoods, baseless slander that we should just call out, laugh at, and refuse to accept.
This kind of leads into the essay that you wrote for the New York Review of Books, that published over the weekend, on kind of the need to articulate a new moral imagination. Can you talk a little bit about what that looks like, you know, independently of or without reference to the kind of narrative that we've been getting from the administration for the last couple of years?
Yeah, the article came out of, there was a New York Times cover story, New York Times Magazine cover story on immigration about a month ago that Robert Draper wrote, and he profiled me as part of that story. And in the story, there was a line where I said, we need a new moral imagination on immigration, and we have to assert it. And so the editor of the New York Review of Books emailed me and said, could you write a piece for me? He said 1,600 words, it's 3,000 words, but I thought that was pretty good. And so I spent a lot of time writing this because I really think we have been on the defensive with a president who has no regard for the truth and has used immigration and immigrants as a political football in a way that no other president has. Because it's not that some of the things that have been happening started with Trump. They have been around. I have worked on detention for a long time. I have great love for President Obama. I miss him deeply, and I had to call him out on a number of things that happened around immigration. It was necessary. But Republican and Democratic presidents until Trump did still hew to the idea that immigration has been something that is important to who we are as a country, important to our values, and important to continue to uphold. This president has departed from that completely. And he has decided that his political calculus is based on the ability to keep immigrants out there as someone to blame. And it's really part of the reason Leadership Conference is so important and the coalition work is so important. Because if we get into a hierarchy of oppressions, that is playing into their hands. That is what they want, is to be able to blame immigrants for their inability to provide health care or take care of education or have opportunity for kids to go to public schools because they're cutting all the funding. So let's just be clear about where the blame lies. And I think that the framework has to be one that is based on a dualistic past, two dueling ideas in our immigration policy and history. One that has really embraced bigotry and racism, and the other that has been very generous to people who are coming from around the world. Both things are true, and the battle gets fought every century, if not multiple times in a century, with every new group that comes. And so I think we have to hold both of those things, and at the same time recognize that unlike any country in the world, we really do have an identity that is linked to immigration, and that is part of our history. It is how the country has been built, sometimes extremely unjustly, and often by taking something from somebody that was here, but also part of who we are. And so that moral center of leadership, of identity, and of our future has to be a part of our policy making. And then you look at the economic needs of a country whose demographics is aging, workforce needs that are necessary for the country to continue to grow, and you think about family as the bedrock. You know, this ridiculous idea of chain migration or somehow that we're not getting the best and the brightest because of family immigration is absurd. Family immigration has been the bedrock of our country, and if you look at it, it has brought us strivers of all levels, of all skills. And it's not that you bring in family and they sit at home and do nothing and take benefits. All those members of your family that have been brought here have helped build the country, have helped take care of grandchildren, have helped take care of parents, but also have filled these job classes that are necessary across the country. And so really thinking about policy from the standpoint of we've been cowards in not addressing immigration policy, not fixing it, not making it so that it actually meets the needs of our country, but also so that it hews to the values of who we are. And so that's really the framework that's laid out in the piece. And I say in there that it's really important for Democrats to stop being afraid of this issue, to take hold of it, to call out lies where there are lies, and to continue to fight for real humane policy.
So, you know, the thing about immigration policy, unlike a lot of other policy areas, is that it really is, you know, pretty much just through the aperture of federal policy. There are some things that can happen at the state and local level, but really so much of what you're talking about is something that right now is in the hands of the Trump administration. So what for the next 2 years are the opportunities that you're seeing as a member of Congress and as a movement leader to articulate this vision while there's still somebody else holding the reins?
Well, come January, guess what happens? We take the majority. And I feel like Aretha Franklin should start playing right now. But it's true. We will have the opportunity to have oversight hearings, to pass bills that renew and restore our hope in rational immigration policy, to message around what is really true and what is false. And I'm on the Judiciary Committee, and I'm really looking forward to that opportunity because I think that we need to take this back. We need to be on the offense. When I've gone on Fox News, I sometimes just laugh. It's a really good strategy because they say the most ridiculous things. We shouldn't always act like we have to answer them. We can literally just laugh and call out the lies. So I think we will have the chance to do that, and at the same time, I think we will also, you know, hopefully in the first 100 days, pass a DREAM Act, a Clean DREAM Act, pass TPS, address the family separations. You're right, Dara, that some of this is administrative, and so it's difficult for us to roll it all back quickly, but we can certainly put real limits on what the administration can do. We can have oversight hearings. We can tell people what's happening. The millions of dollars, tens of millions of dollars we're spending on troops being down at the border when they should have been having, you know, Thanksgiving dinner with their families instead of just sending them down there for nothing. So I think that this is our chance to put forward the vision of what we really see America to be, and to remind ourselves that there would be, you know, that there is no future without all of us, black, brown, and white, coming together, and we can't allow this president to continue to use this issue to divide us. It's just, it has to stop. And so, but we have to be brave about it. We have to be courageous, and we have to just refuse to accept what's handed to us.
I'm glad that you mentioned the point about being courageous, because the other thing I want to talk about is, you know, the lead up to the census in 2020 and the fight that, you know, you've been waging with a lot of other organizations, many of them in this room, to stop the administration from asking about citizenship on the census. How do you, you know, fight that and try to end the chilling effect that that's likely to have on immigrant families, while encouraging the idea, because, you know, it's so crucial to the actual functioning of the census, that people really should stand up and be counted and shouldn't be afraid and should be courageous?
I think it's all about organizing and about how we're going to fight the citizenship question on the census. The Leadership Conference is a leader in that fight. We also, I should just mention, we have the most progressive House in the history of the country. And we now have 94, 95 members of the Progressive Caucus. 40% of House Democrats are progressives, and I'm proud to be a co-chair of the Progressive Caucus. And so we have a new opportunity, I think, to address the actual citizenship question in the census. If we're not successful with that, then there are some other tactics around how we ensure that everyone can be counted, how we, stop a scarlet letter from being on somebody if they answer, and those tactics are all being developed right now. But federal dollars depend on the census, as you know, and so it is incredibly important that we get people to answer. And when I'm on the budget committee, and I tried to pass an amendment that would take the citizenship question out, and I said to my colleagues, you guys are going to lose money on the other side. I mean, Republicans, their districts are going to lose money too, because they have a lot of immigrants, and if they're not counted, they're not going to get money either. But politics overrode everything else, and so they didn't vote for the amendment. But we will continue to push, I think, at the federal level to get the citizenship question out, and then we got to do a lot of organizing to make sure that we are helping to reach out to different ethnic communities through churches, through synagogues, through mosques, all the different ways in which we can reach people and really make sure that they understand how important this census is and how all of our resources for the things we care about, healthcare, education, everything, depends on an accurate census and everyone being counted.
So while I would love to have us leave with just putting pressure on everybody in this room to go out and make sure everyone stands up and is counted, I know that we're the last thing of the day, so I want to give everyone a little more of a positive note to end on. So what are you most excited for in the coming couple of years?
Well, look, I think that the times when we have made progress in this country on big issues, civil rights, voting rights, whatever the issues are the times when we've also seen backlash. After segregation, school segregation was ended, you saw the kind of backlash that came back, the people that tried to stop that from still being implemented in spite of the court's rulings. And you have seen that every time. And so I take hope in the idea that when you see this kind of backlash and you feel like we're taking steps backward, that you actually look at that as that moral arc of the universe bending towards justice, as the theme of the conference is, that is part of making progress. And maybe I'll just end with, has anybody read the Book of Joy, Story of Joy, or Book of Joy? It's a conversation between Archbishop Tutu and the Dalai Lama, who I had the incredible honor to meet several times actually in the last year and spend time with. And in there, I've always described myself as an optimist, but in there, Archbishop Tutu says, there's a real difference between hope and optimism. Optimism is created. It's ephemeral. It's somewhat transient. If it's created, it can be taken away. Whereas hope is something that comes from deep inside of you. Hope is something that is here and here and here. And nobody can take it away because it is too strong of a force within us. And so I think that in this room, we have a group of people who are hopists, not optimists, and I'm calling myself a hopist because I really believe that we're on the precipice of some enormous changes for good in this country. But don't think it's not going to be a fight. But everybody in this room has fought before. We will fight before, if we will fight again, and we will win. Thank you. All right, thank you. Yeah. Thanks, everybody.
Awesome. Thank you.
Perfect. Please welcome to the stage Ashley Allison of the Leadership Conference.
Thank you.
What a day. What a day. When we decided just a couple months ago to plan a 500-person conference, we wanted to make it a mission to build. We're a coalition, and we know how to build coalition, but we also wanted this room to be a moment to build community. So we hope that you are leaving with a greater sense of a community, feeling more empowered to do the great work that you all do each and every day, and that you have met someone that you don't know. And if you haven't, there is a 3-hour holiday party where you can actually take that action. I also just wanted to give a shout out to Wade Henderson, who I'm hearing is in the room, our former president and CEO. And I'm not sure if Karen is still here. But if you know the Leadership Conference, you know Karen, you know Wade, you know Nancy, you know Ellen. You know that they worked so many years before this new leadership team was able to come and take over. But they really built what we are standing on today. So thank you. Now, I know you always get in trouble when you start calling names, but first I want to thank the entire hotel staff, the audio crew, they're members of Local 25. You can't have lunch and you can't do something like this if you don't have people who are willing to work hand in hand with you. And I want to thank the entire Leadership Conference staff, but I particularly want to name a couple people who have spent long hours working over the last couple of weeks. So Brent Johnson, if you're there over on the side of the stage. Lindsay Montague, who is probably somewhere putting up all this creative. She designed all of it. Haywood, who made all the logistics happen. Tamara Elaine Chrysler, who was our goddess, voice of goddess today in the back. And Jordan Bussey, who handled all of our registration, as well as the Rabin group, Demara, Erica, and Rachel, who helped think the vision of the day. So thank you all for coming. We don't know if we're going to do this next year or not. You're going to get an evaluation tomorrow to let us know what you liked, what you didn't like, but because we do want to continue to create spaces where you all can connect. We have state partners from all across the country that work on various issues in this room today. We have our coalition, we have friends, we have funders in the room. So thank you for taking your entire day and spending it with us to push forward on civil and human rights. I also want to let you know, if you haven't seen it, there's 2 white pillowcasey looking things that say "Bend Towards Justice." Those are our step and repeats. Feel free to take a picture of them and hashtag Bend Towards Justice to make sure that people know that you're here doing this good work and we're all building a community together. And I think this might be the first time in the history of civil rights that we're ending early. So I'm not going to stand before you any longer, but you have about a 45-minute break for those who are going to join us at the holiday party up in the Palladian Ballroom. We hope to see you because there'll be hundreds of people there continuing to celebrate. We work really hard, so we deserve to play a little hard. So thank you all for coming, and let's keep bending towards justice. Thank you.
Everyone, please join us in the Palladian Ballroom and Terrace for our holiday reception starting at 5:30.